Hello, welcome back to Reality Check. I'm Ross Coulthart, and this week we're not looking at UFOs, UAPs, but we are investigating a very intriguing aviation mystery that I have found fascinating for the last 10 years. It's coming back to life after a company called Deep Sea Vision says they've found Amelia Earhart's plane in the Pacific Ocean. Now, the company's CEO, Tony Romeo, says they're going to find flight MH370. The Malaysian Airlines commercial passenger jet, a gigantic 224-foot long, 60-foot high 777 Boeing. And on the 8th of March 2014, it just disappeared, along with the 239 people on board, including 12 crew. So how does a commercial passenger jet just disappear? And of course, this whole story has aroused an innumerable number of conspiracy theories. I think the bigger the mystery, the more likely there is that there's a conspiracy theory. Now, we are talking at a time when there's talk of a new search. There are search companies that are pitching to Malaysian Airlines in the hope that the airline will agree to have a new search. There's previously been two major searches costing hundreds of millions of dollars, and not a skerrick of plane was found by any of those official searches. What has been found over the years have been extraordinary pieces of the plane, alleged, including pieces that appear to come from the right wing of the aircraft, a flaperon and other large pieces of the plane. And these have been analysed and assessed as very likely coming from MH370. But as you'll hear today, there's even a question mark about that. Let's start first. It's not a complex case, oddly enough. It may seem to be, but it's not complex. I find it intriguing. The official investigation, the official search for the plane, started with the premise that the plane had done a U-turn in the middle of the South China Sea and that it was tracked on radar, its final radar points showing it departing Malaysian airspace and heading out towards the southern Indian Ocean on a track that was subsequently confirmed by beeps from an Inmarsat satellite that was communicating with the engines on the plane. It was subsequently assessed by experts that the plane disappeared along what's called the seventh arc, which is a long line of the southern Indian Ocean ending up somewhere parallel with Perth, Western Australia. Now, what intrigues me about this whole case is that there's a question mark now about whether the assumptions that were made that drove the original search for MH370 were based on a correct assumption. The assumption that was made at the time was that there was nothing sinister about this case involving the crew or the pilot in particular. The suggestion was that the pilots had in some way become incapacitated, maybe by fire, and that the plane continued for some reason on autopilot until it ran out of fuel along that seventh arc in the southern Indian Ocean, and then it slowly spiraled out of control and crashed into the sea, never to be seen again. That's what drove a lot of the assumptions that drove the official search. Now, there has been over the years what's called an independent group of researchers, some very reputable scientists and investigators who've got together to look at what they think happened to the jet. And on reanalysis, there's a growing suspicion that it may very well be the case that there was a rogue pilot scenario, whether it be Captain Zahari Ahmed Shah or his co-pilot or someone else. Somebody, it's suspected, may have in fact attempted to take control of the plane, maybe locking out the co-pilot, and then controlled landing that plane after it ran out of fuel, after the plane had glided well beyond the existing search area, and landed the plane, very precariously of course, on the surface of the Indian Ocean. Now, that theory holds that that's why the plane is largely in one piece, probably, at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, and why large chunks of this plane, including, God forbid, bodies and other debris, have not been found in large numbers when the official searches happened. Now, I did a story about that controlled landing scenario, which was at the time very unpopular and contrary to what the Australian investigators were pushing, and I pushed it through the services and assistance and advice of a guy called Larry Vance, who's a former Canadian air crash investigator who worked for the Canadian Transportation Safety Bureau. And Larry's theory is the one that I think is the most likely theory based on the Occam's razor principle, that the simplest explanation that explains why the plane hasn't been found in the existing search area is that for some reason a pilot took control of the plane, waited until it had run out of fuel, glided it beyond the existing search area, and consistently with the beeps that went back to a satellite that said that the plane was in the southern Indian Ocean, they somehow landed the plane on the surface of the ocean, and only a few select pieces of that plane came off during the landing, and that those are the pieces that were subsequently found on the other side of the Indian Ocean. Now, that's the current Occam's razor most plausible theory in my view. As you would all know, there are a lot of conspiracy theories about MH370, and I cannot do justice to all of them here. There are many people who have spent days, weeks, years propounding alternative theories. But there is one person I respect who's done what I think is good old getting the foot on the ground journalism, and her name is Florence de Changy. She's a Le Monde newspaper journalist based out of Hong Kong. And Florence has done some excellent work scrutinising a lot of the early evidence before the plane supposedly turned and disappeared from the South China Sea. And she has assembled a theory in her book which suggests that the plane was in fact taken over or brought down by the American military in a conspiracy to try and stop valuable equipment from getting to the Chinese government. Now, I am extremely sceptical about this theory. I want to be upfront about that, and I've been sceptical with Florence in the interview. But I do think it's important to give this theory an airing, because Florence does raise some critical questions which have gone unanswered to this day. Suggestions of previous distress calls that have not been properly addressed by the Malaysian investigators or the government or the police. The suggestion that there were undeclared cargoes on board the plane that hadn't been properly inspected. And I must say, it does strain credibility to me that a massive jet like this could just disappear, largely without trace. I do think that we have to consider all possibilities. And so today, we're going to hear first from Larry Vance, and then Florence de Changy. And I want you, the viewer, to be the judge. I want you to let me know what you think, because there's very likely to be a new search for MH370. I think the Malaysian government may very well make an announcement in the next few weeks, and one can only sincerely hope that we get an answer finally as to what happened in this tragic event. I've interviewed family members who lost loved ones on the plane, and it's a pain for them that still hurts to this day, 10 years on. So now, let's get into the mystery of what happened to MH370. Now, today you're going to hear from one of the former top investigators for the Transportation Investigation Board, the TSB, the Transportation Safety Board of Canada, Larry Vance. Larry, I think you've got 18 years of experience in air crash investigation, and you led the investigation into the Swissair 111 crash that I think has direct relevance to the crash that we're talking about today, the Malaysian Airlines MH370 case. So let's bring you in, Larry. I don't want to definitively say that I accept your theory, but I think if we're working on the Occam's razor principle, I've long thought that the explanation that you give for the crash of MH370, the loss of MH370, is the most plausible in the absence of other available evidence. There's a whole lot of conspiracy theories, though, circulating on the web and indeed in reputable TV shows and books suggesting a broader conspiracy. And so I thought as a starting point, it's important to come back to you because when you and I did our first story, we didn't have all the data. We didn't have all the evidence that is now being collected. And what I find intriguing is that you've now written a book which basically summarizes an enormous amount of evidence that takes the investigation further. So let's start, Larry, with what you believe happened with MH370 all those 10 years ago. Give me a potted version of what you believe happened that terrible night.
When that happened, I had already been retired from the Transportation Safety Board here in Canada and was working with some very professional investigators as a consultant, still in the business of aircraft accident investigation. You asked what happened, and I can tell you what happened. On that particular night, the captain implemented a plan that he had developed over some span of time where he was going to make that aircraft disappear, never to be seen again. And he took steps which were well rehearsed to make it happen at the beginning of the event, as far as the airplane going off radar and so on, or going off transponder. And he took the airplane to the most remote area that he could find, which is down in the southern Indian Ocean. And to make the airplane disappear, he set it up intentionally so that he could ditch it on the surface of the ocean so as not to leave anything behind in the way of aircraft wreckage, debris, and so on. His intention was to take it to a spot where nobody would ever find it and nobody would ever know what happened. And that's Ross, that's what happened.
Let's go through that. Why isn't it plausible, Larry, that the reason why those systems failed, the reason why the transponder stopped working, the reason why the ACARS stopped working, is because there was some kind of a fire on board or some kind of an electrical or mechanical malfunction that caused the plane to lose those systems? Isn't it, I'm trying to give the pilot a chance here, isn't it possible that they were incapacitated in some way and that perhaps a fire turned off these electrical systems?
The one thing that has to be accepted comes at the end of the flight. And people have to understand that the aircraft was ditched on the ocean with the flaps extended, and it was ditched at low speed with the intention of making the airplane sink without releasing any debris at all. Once you accept that, then you have to know, Ross, that this had to have been done intentionally. The only person who could do it would be the pilot, who would do that intentionally.
Let me take you then to what you regard as some of the key evidence that has been recovered from this aircraft, which people associate with MH370. I'm talking here, let's start with the flaperon. We know that a flaperon was recovered from Reunion Island, and it has been linked, not definitively, but it's suggested that it came from MH370. It's a Boeing 777 flaperon. What is it, and why is it significant, you argue, to the idea that a rogue pilot landed this plane on the ocean to try and hide it from ever being discovered?
When the flaperon was discovered, you just take a look at it. When I first saw it in the media, I thought, wow, this flaperon is not from an aircraft that was in a high-speed dive like Swissair was in a high-speed dive. The surfaces, the leading edge of the flaperon was what we would call pristine. The upper and lower surfaces were pristine. Now, of course, I'm talking about the aerodynamic shape of them and so on. But the big thing is, of course, the flaperon was eroded.
You're using a term, leading edge. So let's assume the plane was in a spiral dive. It's the leading edge that's the front part of that flaperon. Essentially, if the plane had hit the ocean nose down, it would have been the leading edge that was the first part of the flaperon to hit the ocean. What do you see on that leading edge, and why is it not consistent with a controlled ditching of the aircraft, as you suggest there was?
Right. That's what I was saying. It's the leading edge that is maintained as aerodynamic shape. There's basically no damage on it. If an airplane that hits at such high speed like that, my goodness, the wing in front of that flaperon would just be destroyed, and then not only would there be contact between the pieces that were destroyed in front of it with the leading edge of the flaperon itself would come in contact with the water. And it would be all sunk in. As a matter of fact, that piece of flaperon, it wouldn't even exist in the form that we see it. It wouldn't even exist in that form. It would be gone.
I really want to focus on, firstly, the front part of the leading edge of the flaperon. Now I want to talk about the trailing edge. In the event of a controlled ditching, you're postulating that in the event of a controlled ditching, flaperons normally sit, when they're at flight, tucked up inside the wing to some degree. But when it comes to a landing, I want you to talk me through what you see on what's called the trailing edge of that flaperon, which, if there was a landing on water, it would be the trailing edge that was quite literally trailing in the water that would be making contact with the water. What do you see on the trailing edge of that flaperon, and why is that relevant to the issue of whether or not there was a controlled ditching on the ocean? I know for our audience this might sound complex, but this is, I think, absolutely crucial to an understanding of why I think Larry Vance's theory has a lot of sense to it. If you look at that trailing edge, what do you see, Larry? And talk me through a controlled ditching. What happens in a controlled ditching, and how would it explain what you see on that trailing edge?
In a controlled ditching, the flaps would be extended. It would be down. Everybody knows what flaps look like when the pilot extends them. You do it for landing, and the flaps are dipped down below the wing. If they're up in streamline flight, which is where they would be in a high-speed dive, then it makes one symmetrical wing, if you will. But when you put the flaps down, what you're basically doing is increasing lift, but you're putting this great big barn door, if you will, down behind the wing. Now, if you can picture the airplane in a normal landing attitude or ditching attitude, and the airplane approaching the surface for the ditching, or you could translate that into a landing, if you will, what would happen is that the bottom of the flaps, or the flaps, would start hitting into the water. And, of course, that would put tremendous force down and around the back of the flaps. And when you see the damage to the flaps is very consistent with those flaps being dragged through the water and being eaten away by the force of the impacts with the water, and the water going down and around the bottom of the flaps. It just basically ate them up.
The Australian investigators who responded to your finding that trailing edge damage was caused by water compression, and I find that very plausible, by the way, the Australian investigators suggested that it was a flutter incident, that as the plane was in a spiral dive, in their scenario, it's run out of fuel at 38,000 feet or however high it was, and it goes into a slow spiral dive, speeding up and then eventually hitting the ocean. Their suggestion is that the flaperon fluttered, and that the vibrations caused by that dramatic, aggressive fluttering caused that damage on the trailing edge.
Right. I go through a couple of pages in my book to describe why this is not consistent with flutter. And it has to do with the damage on the flaperon itself. When you have flutter, then you have pounding between the pieces. You have pounding damage, bang, 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 thousands of poundings. that we don't see any evidence of. You have in flutter, you have the surfaces being fluttered up and down, up and down, up and down. The whole flap and flaperon going up and down, and makes cracks in the paint that we don't see. If the piece of flap and the flaperon came off and dropped to the ocean, they would be dropping in free fall at somewhere around 100 miles an hour. It would cause damage to those. You would see damage at the corners. You would see damage at the leading edge from the impact with the water, even from a free fall. It's not feasible that it could be flutter. Now, that's not the only explanation for that, Ross. We have plenty of evidence that talks about the fact that at the time of the aircraft's ditching, there was a spanwise force created along the trailing edge of the wing and forced these pieces together. And we see them being forced together in a crushing motion. It was not pounding. It's not consistent with flutter at all. They were still there. Those pieces were still there when the aircraft entered the water. They couldn't have fallen off first and then still be there at the end. It just doesn't make any sense.
I think it's important for our audience to understand how a pilot would have done this. So I don't know who it was, but we're assuming it was one of the pilots, possibly Captain Zahari. He had an unblemished record, I'm told, but maybe Malaysian Airlines and maybe the Malaysian government's not being as frank with us as it should be about what they know about one or both of those pilots. We just don't know, and we really won't know definitively until the plane is found, which is why a search is so important. But to give your theory the full explanation, I want you to talk me through the scenario as you see it. Paint me a word picture of what you think happened in those final moments of the aircraft.
Right. I think that in as the pilot was getting toward where he was going to, first of all, I think that the pilot had a specific location in mind. As a matter of fact, if you follow the whole scenario, there's absolutely no reason why he wouldn't have chosen a specific spot on the ocean where he wanted to hide that airplane. He wanted to be in an area where he could descend. He wanted to be in an area where he could descend and not be seen by ships on the ocean surface. He chose that area specifically because there are very few ocean-going vessels in that area. He wanted to be in a spot that would be probably forever, or forever in whatever way he was thinking of it, that wouldn't be explored. The bottom of the ocean wouldn't be explored. There's no reason to go out there in that remote area with all the topography at the bottom of the ocean. Nobody's going to go out there and mine minerals and so on. It's just not practical. So he wanted to put it down where there's mountains and valleys and hills and canyons and so on, where nobody's going to come across it by accident. So he had a specific location in mind. So and he knows that he wants to ditch the airplane intentionally. He's going to ditch the airplane so that in his mind there would be no floating debris from the airplane, because as soon as he wanted it to disappear. He didn't want it to ever be known. After it went off primary radar, it could have gone anywhere for any reason. He wanted it to disappear, no doubt about it. So now he's at cruise altitude, and he's implementing his plan. He's saying, okay, now I have to get down. Probably he wants to get down relatively quickly because he doesn't want to travel a great area where there's potential he could be observed from the ground. That you saw a great big airplane like that descending out there and you were on a ship, you'd probably report that to somebody. So he wants to get down relatively quickly. He wants to get down before he runs out of fuel, because he knows he wants to set the airplane up and have full control over it, because that's the configuration you would want to be in to have the best chance of landing the airplane in a successful ditching. So he configures the airplane for the ditching. He starts his descent. On the way down, he determines which is the best direction that he can land according to the waves and swells and so on, and the wind direction. He wants to land in the wind if he can. He assesses all this. He puts the flaps down. Of course, he leaves the landing gear up. He could well have started the APU, the auxiliary power unit, in the tail, because he knows when he touches down, the landing gear is going to be up, but the engines are going to hit first. They're going to stop. If he has the APU running, then he's going to be able to maintain better control of the airplane. He'll have some hydraulics and so on, better steerability.
And the APU is the auxiliary power unit. Can you explain the APU to our audience?
Yeah, the APU, the auxiliary power unit, is up in the tail. It has its air intake up above the stabilizer in the back, and the exhaust is up there too. So that would keep running in a ditching until it eventually would enter the water. So, and it provides pneumatics and electrics, and it basically gives you control over the airplane. His worry would be twofold. One, if he ran out of fuel before he got to the surface, that would give him some chance, or better chance. And then the other thing is, once he touched down on the water, if he still had the APU, which would give him some hydraulics, then he would, in theory, have better control over the last few seconds of the flight. Anyway, regardless, he's trying to get down onto the surface. He now has the aircraft configured for the ditching. He slows down to his chosen ditching speed. He's rehearsed all this. He enters the water. Of course, the flaps enter, and I know what happened. I put it in the book. The right wing got caught in a swell or a wave and caused the right wing to dig in. Anyway, he now gets down to the surface of the ocean, and his ditching is complete. As far as he's concerned, his attempt was to not release any pieces from the airplane. He wasn't successful. Thank God he wasn't, because we got pieces of flap and flaperon and some other pieces that we can string together the evidence to prove that, in fact, that's what happened.
Larry, there's no getting over the fact that what you postulate is an incredible slur on the reputation of Captain Zaharie, who's the prime suspect in your book. There's absolutely no evidence anywhere publicly to suggest that Zaharie was suffering from a mental illness, or that he had any malicious motives towards either the airline or anyone to justify what essentially is an act of mass murder, killing himself and a complement of 239 people on that jet. Why on earth did he do this? If this is true, it's an appalling act of murder-suicide. Where's the evidence to suggest that he had a motive for wanting to do this?
Well, I cover motive in my book, and the way I explain it in the book is the way I'll explain it to you. The fact is that he did it. The evidence shows that he did it. And the fact that the fact that there is no reasonable explanation for why he did it does not cancel out the fact that it happened and the fact that he did it.
I want to get into the nitty-gritty now of the evidence that at the time you and I first met, all we knew about really was the flaperon. You know, the flaperon was the one piece of evidence that had been recovered at the time, and you were able to reach a definitive conclusion even back then that you believed that this was a controlled ditching. But in the years since you and I first spoke, there's been other pieces of debris that have been collected and discovered, which are almost certainly from MH370. And one of them, for example, is a recovered section of wing flap from the same right outboard wing as the flaperon. It's a 15-foot by 6-foot chunk of the wing flap. What I found interesting is that there's, again, no damage to its leading edge, which, as you've rightly pointed out, is the edge that would have been most damaged if the plane had gone nose first into the ocean. But there's also damage, again, to the trailing edge of that piece of wing flap. Why is that significant? Just explain that to me, please.
Yeah, for the same reason it's significant on the flaperon. The leading edge on the piece of flap it would be tucked up into the wing in a high-speed diving crash, would be tucked up into the wing. The wing in front of it would be disintegrated. In that 1/3 of a second that we talked about, as a matter of fact, if you do the mathematics from the front of the wing to the trailing edge of the wing, it would take 0.04 seconds, I believe it is, for that whole wing to have been completely destroyed. And then it just doesn't make any sense that in a high-speed dive that piece of flap could even exist in the condition that we find it in. And then, of course, on the trailing edge, we see the erosion or the breaking off of pieces, very consistent with the fact that this was dragged through the water the same way we talked about the flaperon.
In your book, you talk about internal stiffeners inside the wing. They're the things that are used to help make the wing rigid and strong. And you've described in your book how if there'd been a high-speed crash, a spiraling crash into the ocean at super, super high speed, those bits of wing, if you like, would show deformity to those internal stiffeners that was consistent with a front to back, a front to aft collision. You don't see that in those internal stiffeners, do you?
In that sort of high-speed diving crash, the wings wouldn't survive and look like a wing. The flap wouldn't survive and look like a flap. The flaperon wouldn't survive and look like a flaperon. It just would not happen. Again, do the mathematics. Do the 0.04 of a second for that thing to hit into something that would cause such destruction as non-compressible water.
I think it'll help our audience to look at some of the photographs that were taken of the debris and to look at some of these so-called witness marks that you talk about. And in one of the photographs, there's a black V-shaped smudge witness mark on that recovered outboard flap section. And so it's kind of like a black smudge. And for anybody who's an amateur looking at that, they wouldn't give it a moment's thought. But you've attached an enormous amount of significance to that smudge. Why do you think that smudge is significant?
There's a rub strip that they build into the side of the flaperon to basically fill that little gap between it and the flap. And these V-shaped black marks that you see there were created when this rub strip was forced at very, very high force, was forced to be squeezed between the flaperon and the flap. There's a dynamic there with the architecture, but basically, when we studied where these V-shaped marks were located, one in relation, let me put it this way: the only conclusion we could draw was that the flaps had to be extended. The flap and the flaperon had to be extended for those to be created in the exact spot where they were.
I want to go now to two other pieces of wreckage that are twins from each side of the aeroplane that also got recovered. They're fixed panels that were forward of the flaperon from both wings. What do those fixed panels show that's consistent with your theory of a controlled ditching?
Right. What we see from the twin pieces, what I call in my book the twin pieces, is that both of them are from the top surface of the wing right in front of the flaperon. What this shows us is that when that aircraft was skimming across the top of the water, both of the flaperons and flap sections on both sides, the left and right, were both being dragged through the water in the same way. We would see, if we had them, similar damage at the trailing edge of the flap and of the flaperon on the left side. What happened was, as the pressure built on the flaps and the flaperon, these twin pieces were exposed to extreme pressure, because those are the points where those pieces are held onto the wing, and the tension in there simply caused those two pieces to pop, and they popped off the top of the wing, one on one side and one on the other. and they became part of the floating debris, the minimum number of pieces of floating debris. So what that shows us, Ross, is that the airplane was basically wings level when it was undergoing the controlled ditching. It was wings level.
The one thing I want to raise with you is there is a lot of stuff on the plane that you don't see in any of the recovered debris. There's no personal effects, there's no luggage, and obviously, sadly, there's no bodies. You would have expected to have seen a lot of floating material, even if it was in disintegrated form, from a high-speed crash. And your crucial point is that everything that you're seeing in the evidence that has been collected is consistent with a controlled ditching on the surface of the ocean.
Right. You can take every piece that was identified by the official investigation and account for that piece with a controlled ditching. It's quite amazing. I explain in the book that there are pieces from inside the fuselage, so we know that the fuselage had to have been breached, and where that had to have happened was at the wing root of the right wing. All that spanwise force eventually caused the trailing edge of the right wing to break through into the fuselage, and the pieces that you see from inside the airplane had to have come out through there, except for the one at the R1 door, the front door, which we think that the R1 door actually popped open because of the stresses of this wing being forced back and so on, and the nose of the airplane flopping down into the water. Seems like the right R1 door opened, but these pieces from inside the fuselage had to have come out through the cavity that was made when the back end of the right wing broke through into the fuselage. That's what we think happened there.
It's 10 years, Larry, a full decade since this jet disappeared. It's the biggest mystery in modern aviation. It's just extraordinary that a passenger jet of this size, with so many people on board, 239 souls, can disappear and not be found. How important is it, do you believe, that we get an answer, that you're able to definitively test the truth of what you claim happened to MH370?
Right, Ross, I think that the title of my book is part of the answer. The title of my book is MH370 Mystery Solved. I think that there is enough evidence to show exactly what happened to the airplane. I don't think there's any doubt that there is that amount of evidence, if you go through it carefully and methodically, to show what happened to the airplane. I don't think it's the biggest mystery in the world at all. I think that mystery is solved. Why it happened is not solved, because that can only be solved if you come up with a motivation for the pilot. This is not a complicated thing at all, Ross. It was not complicated at all for this pilot to make that airplane disappear. It would be very complicated if it was, in fact, some kind of an accident. It would take a very complicated series of events for an accident to have caused this airplane to disappear. All the things that we know that happened, even on radar and primary radar and so on, where it went, with all the pings and so on, all that stuff would be extremely complicated if you accept the fact that this pilot conducted the event by himself. It is not complicated at all. As a matter of fact, it's easy to do.
So, Larry,
yeah,
I can't definitively say that I accept your theory, but I certainly think that on the Occam's razor principle, it's perhaps the most plausible theory of all. What I wrestle with is the motivations of the pilot. And frankly, I do have suspicions that Malaysia and Malaysian Airlines were never fully candid with the public and with investigators in Australia about the extent of what they know about what happened. I don't know if we'll ever know the answer until the wreckage of that plane is found. But I do want to thank you for giving us your theory today. And I really do sincerely appreciate you giving us your time.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's very nice talking to you.
So I'd like now to welcome in Florence de Changy, the eminent reporter, investigative reporter from a top French newspaper, Le Monde. Florence has done a fascinating book called Disappearing Act, The Impossible Case of MH370. And I think the title itself shows that we both share the frustration of not knowing for sure what really happened to MH370. So, Florence, I'd love it if you could perhaps tell me what you speculate you think happened to MH370 10 years ago on the 8th of March, 2014.
I think without going into details, because I keep working on it and my scenario as published has changed to some extent, but in a nutshell, the plane did not disappear. It was disappeared. That story is not incredible. It is simply not credible. And people should stop talking about a mystery, because if it's something, it's a secret and it's not a mystery. This is my general approach to this story, you know, and from pretty early on, I started realizing that it was simply an insult to human intelligence to claim that we could lose a B777 and 239 people.
Well, that's a big call, obviously, but let's go through the detail. What do you think happened to MH370? I think you're actually suggesting that the Americans may indeed be complicit in some way. And this is the thing that I find difficult to accept, in collusion with not only the Malaysians and other governments in the area of the South China Sea, but also the Chinese. Just explain to me your conspiracy theory and explain to me why you think it's got credibility.
We're jumping to the very, very, very last stages of my investigation, and I didn't get there neither lightly nor quickly. You know, originally when I covered the story in March 2014 for my newspaper, and you were there as well, after a week or so, or 10 days later, I left once they found the big debris in the Southern Indian Ocean, and they seemed pretty confident, and everyone was kind of agreeing on the official narrative. Just me, like everyone else, I believed what we were told, because you had big authorities telling us, you know, big governments, including indeed the White House, and very good companies like Inmarsat. So all the means that we had, the satellite images, seemed to say, well, the plane is there. And it took me really years to revisit everything step by step. And when finally I arrived at a moment of crisis, which I think is around 2:40 or about that time in the morning, remember that the plane left at about 40 minutes after midnight, so 2 hours into the flight, that's the moment, I think, when the plane met its fate, let's say, to remain a little bit open and vague. And that moment happened most likely en route towards Beijing. And then what happened exactly then, I am still not sure. And I did write a scenario where, based on a cluster of corroborating evidence, and we can go through all of them then, and then you will see why. And sorry, it's a very long answer to your question. But then when I saw that this happened there, I thought, okay, it's basically almost in the Chinese airspace. Now, who could be responsible for that? Who can deal with a B777? I mean, in this day and age and in the world in which we live, logically, it can only be a very big power. Malaysia hasn't got the means to disappear a B777. Vietnam hasn't got the means to disappear a B777. So let's think simply. It's either the US or China. And if we find that it's neither them nor the other ones, we will go into the Russians, we will go into the North Korean, you know, and all the other usual suspects. But because of what we're dealing with, let's look at China and America. And that's where I started looking at the relationship between these two powers on these days, on the coming days. And that's where I just found incredible evidence. And I put this evidence to anyone who knows how these two people, I mean, power and people and countries deal with each other. And they say, oh, wow, indeed. Now that I see, you know, what happened between the presidents, I started with the presidents, you know, it's the most obvious one, how she and Barack Obama talked to each other, the meetings they had, the calls they had. And it really looks like one is behaving as the guilty party and one is behaving as the one who is in a position to bargain for what happened. And that's how I came to the conclusion that it seems to me that the US are the guilty party. And plus, obviously, the fact that the US have absolutely not contributed any of their phenomenal means to the search.
There's a general theme in your book that suggests America, the United States, was responsible, that there was a collusion because there was a military exercise involving American and other allied forces around the South China Sea that particular night. There were AWACS in position, airborne early warning aircraft with very sophisticated technology. And you speculate that those AWACS may have been used to in some way block any transmissions from MH370. And indeed, in your book, you even suggest that they may have used prototype laser weapons to bring down the plane.
There was actually information in the local newspaper the next day that the plane had emitted what they call the code Tango. This is in the Malaysian press. Another pilot mentioned that Zahari, we don't know, but MH370 had emitted the code Tango. Tango is what in Malaysia Airlines they use to inform everyone that the plane is being hijacked. So this is very troubling because if MH370 managed, despite whatever happened to it, to signal to the company that it was being hijacked, it's already a big red flag that basically the cockpit, the captain and the co-pilot, are not responsible. They are victims somehow. So Code Tango, first thing. It has been quite ignored quickly on, but it is still on the record. It's there. And then I also got access to the official police investigation where they mention it and where they re-interview some of the pilots who heard the Code Tango. So that's one thing.
Let's go through the key allegation that's central to the allegation that the plane is in the southern Indian Ocean. It's very much now the idea being pushed by Malaysian Airlines privately, by my government privately, and indeed a growing view among investigators that the plane was taken over by a rogue pilot, perhaps under a controlled glide, guided beyond the known search area or the described search area, and landed in an area of the Indian Ocean far beyond where it's currently been searched. What do you think of the allegations against Captain Zahari? What did you find on the ground? Because I want to credit you with the fact that you've spoken to family members, you've got your boots dirty and got in there and done a dig. What did you find?
Well, when I decided that I was going to revisit the story for the first anniversary, I really thought that Captain Zahari was key to the whole story, and I needed to have a clear idea. I mean, everyone knows that a human person, even the best, could be turned. And there were all these allegations, as we said. So I thought before anything else in that story, I need to have a clear idea of who is this pilot. And I went to Kuala Lumpur again, once more, with almost just that in mind. I also, of course, met some of the families. Actually, last week, I saw some of them that I met 10 years ago, basically. And we remembered each other, the meeting we had at the time. But Zahari, I started with some members of his family and then met colleagues of him. And I met people who were at school with him when he was small. and I met some people who decided to do a Facebook page to honor him, etc. And every meeting, I was discovering a person who was not just a good, kind of average man, because, he had, I mean, number one, he was very passionate about his flying, no doubt about that. When he's not flying, he's flying either on a simulator, or he's instructing, or he's playing with planes above the lake. He loves to do it yourself, fixing air conditioner. His sister told me that he also loved to cook, actually, and he would often cook for her, and she was married to a Chinese man, which also shows you that it was a very open-minded family. He was the last of 9 siblings. He was the only one, and he was being teased in his family because he was the only one who did not go to university, being just a pilot, despite the fact that they were coming from very modest family background in the first place. But eventually everyone did very good studies. I mean, everything I found was compelling to make me understand that this was a very good person.
What happened to the debris evidence? It just seems to have disappeared, doesn't it?
Yes, the debris evidence was just a few things. At one stage it was like a door, and then there were also the big debris that the Chinese satellites have spotted and that were immediately dismissed. You may remember, very big ones, which were more like the size of the wing of a plane. And Hishamuddin Hussein at the time said, oh, they've shared these images by mistake. And I was like, it's not exactly the style of the Chinese to share satellite images by mistake. But so this was pushed aside very quickly. And yes, and another thing which is interesting too is that there were lots of witnesses on the east coast of Malaysia who claimed during that night that they heard very strange noises. Some of them say that they've seen fragments of fire falling from the sky. Another one described a noise like a tsunami. Another one described very low flying plane, and I've kind of identified where this plane was going to. It was absolutely not flying full due west, but it was actually probably going to the Hatay airport in Thailand. I mean, there is a lot of things happening that night in that place, for sure, and we have these witnesses, they have nothing to lose. They are simple people. They don't want to lie for the sake of lying. If they go and report to the police the next day, it's because they saw what they saw, and they're not sure of what it is, but they feel the need to share because they think that maybe they have a bit of the truth. So yes, we have a lot of things happening in that part of the world.
So let's talk about the evidence that people like, for example, former Canadian crash investigator Larry Vance used to suggest that there was a controlled landing of MH370 in the southern Indian Ocean, the flaperon. So in July 2015, on Reunion Island, just near Mauritius in the southern Indian Ocean, a large chunk of flaperon, which was allegedly from the right wing of MH370, was discovered. And it showed what Larry Vance alleges is clear evidence of water on the trailing edge of the flap, the edge that would have connected with the water in the event of a landing on the ocean. And it shows what he suggests is an abrasion on the edge of that trailing edge, consistent with the flap having been extended and landing on the surface of the ocean. Now, for your theory to be correct, let's be very clear about this. You would have to suggest, wouldn't you, that that flaperon was a plant, that it wasn't actually from MH370, and that it was planted there as part of this conspiracy. Do you agree?
First of all, the simple fact that this flaperon landed in Reunion 500 days later, and basically 5,000 kilometers in straight line, this already should have stopped anyone from believing for a second that this could be from the MH370 if the crash happened where they told us it crashed. I don't know if you remember, but after 50 days, Tony Abbott, the Australian Prime Minister at the time, had said, well, I'm really sorry, but now let's be reasonable. 50 days. Things by now will obviously be waterlogged, even the pieces that float the most, like the seats, because these pieces of composite, fuselage, etc., they float for a little bit because they're quite light, but they are not meant to float forever. And all the more, all the less when they are broken pieces like this one, right? And we're in the fiercest ocean of the planet, with waves. We've seen them. I'm a sailor as well. I have seen some big waves, probably not as bad as that ones, but waves that are 15 meters high. So this piece should have endured more or less 2 winters in the southern Indian Ocean and traveled these 5,000 kilometers. I worked out that it had to do something like 7 or 10 miles a day in straight line to reach Reunion, which makes no sense.
Another one that I find interesting, and I do concede this does raise a doubt in my mind, is there's new research that's been done by Australian researchers into the barnacles, the shellfish life that were found on the flaperon. And it's not consistent. The barnacle growth on the flaperon, it's quite definitive. It's not consistent with barnacle growth that should have happened on the flaperon if it had drifted across from a wreck on the 7th arc in the Southern Ocean over 16 months. There should have been much more growth of barnacle life. And the Australian researchers are saying that it's consistent only with about 4 months growth. Is that something you have a view on?
In the same technical report that the French did, they mentioned something else, which is very problematic related to these barnacles. And it's not the matter of the size, it's the way they grew on the flaperon, which is not completely consistent with the way the flaperon is supposed to float. So the piece is supposed to float with a certain, flotation line, even though it's obviously, bobbling along and changing a little bit, but still, and we see it with rubbish that you see in the sea, you see a clear line of where things are below water and where things is exposed to the air. And in that case, they say that the growth of barnacles is not consistent with the way the thing was floating. So it makes you think that maybe when they try to grow these poor barnacles, they attached probably the flaperon in a position which was not quite natural. I mean, it's shocking to read all that. It's I don't exactly know what to do with it, but it's clearly not consistent with an original piece that landed there by accident.
If this really was an American operation, and you speculate that it was intended to stop a cargo, a precious cargo of some kind on board Malaysian Airlines from being delivered to Beijing, you speculate it might even have been drone technology from Afghanistan as Afghanistan was being quietly shut down. Isn't it more plausible that if the Americans had wanted to stop a plane like that, they could have just stopped the cargo from getting on the plane in Kuala Lumpur? Why did they need to go to the elaborate effort of allegedly shooting a plane down in the Gulf of Thailand and then colluding with China, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, and other countries in this massive cover-up to conceal the shoot down of an aircraft?
No, I completely agree. And towards my conclusion, when I'm trying to work out this hypothetical scenario, just based on what I have, I am the first one to admit that there are loose ends here. Things do not add up. But what I think may have happened to, and I had exactly the same question than yours, if they wanted to stop it, it would have been much easier to stop it from starting. And also this operation seems so sophisticated that I don't think it could have been improvised. It's not like, oh, I've just learned that this cargo has left, we should stop it, because you can't do that reasonably in a matter of 40 minutes. You can't scramble jets, have people on ground ready to receive it, have the airport at night open to let the Boeing land, etc. But what I thought was probably planned was an interception operation. That, yes, indeed, that operation was planned. Once the plane arrive just in between the two airspace, they inform it that it should go there, land. Once it's landed, they take the cargo out. I noticed that this cargo was actually last in, hence first out, easy to take out. And you close back the doors. People who are escorting or not this cargo leave at that time or go back in the plane. The plane takes off again. It arrives with maybe 20, maybe 40 minutes delay in Beijing, which is a non-event because the planes very often arrive late. If people are asking questions, we say there was a heart attack in business class. End of the story. This would have been this would have been mission accomplished, an interception, slightly sophisticated, but this thing happened, operation that would have been perfectly run. Now, what I'm imagining, assuming, guessing, is the fact that maybe Captain Zahari, being a very principled and very experienced pilot, may have refused to follow the orders once he was told, please now go and land there, and we just need to do something, and you will be okay after that. He may have resisted the order. That's possible. That is consistent with his character, and I've checked that with people who knew him. And then from there, things started going very wrong. But that's where my evidence is meeting with my attempt to create a logical scenario, which makes a bit of sense based also on all my sources in the military and in the region, etc.
Well, Florence de Changy, I have to say, your book did give me some considerable cause for pause on the essentially what has been pushed as the very simple explanation that it was a rogue pilot. I don't think we'll ever know the answer until and if Malaysian Airlines 370 is recovered, wherever it is. But look, I thank you very much for talking to Reality Check today, and thank you very much for joining us and giving us your views.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you for having the intellectual honesty to possibly change your mind, because that's what we need most. And I am also happy and ready to change my mind as soon as I'm presented with strong evidence. And as far as I'm concerned, I do not think we will find the plane, but I do think we will find the truth.
Well, I certainly hope we do. Florence de Changy, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ross.
Thanks for watching. Go to joinnn.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And please don't forget to click that red subscribe button to ensure you get more of NewsNation's unbiased and fact-driven news coverage.